The story of the flood, found in chapters 6 to 9 of the book of Genesis, begins with God observing that the world had become corrupt and filled with violence after 10 generations from Adam. Disappointed by humanity's wickedness, God decided to destroy all life on earth. However, he found one righteous man, Noah, and chose him to survive the coming disaster. God instructed Noah to build an ark, a large vessel to save himself, his family, and pairs of every animal species. God told Noah that he would send a great flood to wipe out all life, with rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights. Noah obeyed and built the ark as God had commanded. At the age of 600, Noah, his wife, their sons, and their wives entered the ark, along with the animals, as the flood began. When the flood came, the waters covered the earth, rising higher than the tallest mountains, and every living thing perished. The flood lasted for 40 days and nights, and after 150 days, the waters began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. After another period of waiting, Noah sent out a raven and then a dove to see if the waters had fully subsided. The dove eventually returned with an olive leaf, signaling that the land was dry. In Noah's 601st year, the earth was dry, and God instructed him to leave the ark with his family and the animals. Upon exiting, Noah built an altar and made a sacrifice to God. Pleased with Noah's offering, God promised never to send another flood to destroy the earth. As a sign of this covenant, God set a rainbow in the sky, symbolizing his promise that the world would never again be flooded to such an extent. God then gave Noah and his descendants the responsibility to repopulate the earth. He allowed them to eat animals, but forbade consuming their blood. This covenant marked the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's relationship with God. Modern scholars generally agree that the book of Genesis was written around the 5th century BCE. However, since the first 11 chapters, known as the primeval history, seem somewhat disconnected from the rest of the book, some believe these sections might have been written as late as the 3rd century BCE. It is widely accepted that the Genesis account is based on two main sources, the priestly source and the non-priestly or Yahweh source. This is evident in the repetition of certain elements within the narrative, such as the differing accounts of the flood's duration, 40 days in Genesis 7:17 versus 150 days in 7:24. The number of animals brought onto the ark, 1 pair of each in 6:19 versus 1 pair of unclean animals, and 7 pairs of clean animals in 7:2. And the story of Noah releasing either a raven or a dove to check if the waters had receded, with variations in how each bird behaves. These inconsistencies, however, don't undermine the story's overall coherence. Some scholars view the narrative as structured in a way where the first and last elements mirror each other, and efforts have been made to explain this unity, including attempts to determine which source came first and influenced the other. Other scholars have questioned whether the story truly comes from two separate sources, pointing out that some of the so-called contradictions, like those involving the dove and raven, actually appear as link motifs in both biblical and non-biblical texts. They argue that the doublets are inconsistently applied, with some sources containing their own repetitions, and that the theory assumes an editor who combined the sources in inconsistent ways, sometimes making extensive edits and other times keeping contradictory versions. Additionally, the Genesis flood story aligns closely with the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a connection that doesn't seem to fit neatly into either of the proposed biblical sources. The primeval history primarily focuses on the world that God created, exploring its origins, inhabitants, purposes, challenges, and failures. It addresses the imperfection of the world God made and seeks to understand the meaning behind human violence and evil. The solutions presented in the narrative involve concepts like covenant, law, and forgiveness. The creation story in Genesis chapters 1 to 2 explains God's act of creation, while the flood narrative in Genesis offers a rationale for God's repentance. In the priestly source, which runs throughout Genesis and the other books of the Torah, the verbs create and forgive are used exclusively for divine actions. Intertextuality refers to how biblical stories reference and reflect each other, often intentionally. For example, the word used for ark in the flood story is the same as the word for the basket in which Moses is saved, suggesting a parallel between the stories of two divinely chosen figures in a world threatened by water and chaos. One of the most significant intertextual echoes in the flood narrative is a reversal of the Genesis creation story. In the flood, the separation between the waters above and waters below is undone. The dry land is submerged. Most life is destroyed, and only Noah and his family survive to fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply. The flood story represents both a reversal and a renewal of God's original creation. In Genesis 1, God separates the waters above from those below to create dry land for life to inhabit. But during the flood, the windows of heaven and fountains of the deep are opened, returning the world to a state of watery chaos, like before creation. The sequence of events in the flood mirrors that of creation. The waters cover the earth, and in order, birds, cattle, beasts, swarming creatures, and finally, mankind are destroyed. This parallel can be found in the Babylonian flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where after the rain, all of mankind had returned to clay, the material from which they were originally formed. Additionally, the ark itself is depicted as a microcosm of Solomon's temple.